Hey everybody, Chris here. How you doing? I got another video. This time we're making a what they call a lap strake style boat. It's what Vikings used to build, although they would just put the layer them rather than have like a substructure that I'm building here. I'm just using some like foam board that I got. It's used for signs, things like that. Somebody gave me a whole ton of it, so it's good. It's foam on the inside, and then it's got like this plastic layer on the outside. It's really thin, and it's easy to work with. So I just do it. I just marked the center point here, measured everything, and then measured out kind of for the size of the boats from the bow to the stern, and just sort of kind of roughly drew the whole thing. It took on sort of a triangular shape, I guess, and just measured it a little bit here. I didn't like how thin it looked, so I went ahead and just made it a little bigger on the stern side of the boat here. So drawing the front, it came out kind of like a triangle shape, but I still thought it was pretty cool. I build these type of things for to be played on, not to be realistic. Obviously, if I was making this more realistic, there's nothing is square on a if you ever look at the hull of a boat, everything's all rounded, and and then it would come up obviously on the front and then come up on the back. These I make flat, the bottoms are flat, so that you could put your minis inside it, and then it sits flat on whatever terrain you have. It's just easier to work with that way and simple. I also don't put in any 1-inch squares to mark it. I use a stick that I have made in the past and put 1-inch measurements on there. And then we just measure it, and it's fine, and it's easy, and you can measure angles really easy that way rather than having to sort of count, kind of squares on a diagonal and making sure everything has squares, but also trying to make it somewhat realistic. So I'm measuring out the sides of the boat. I had a cloth, those cloth measuring sticks they use for fabric. I had one of those, and used that to kind of bend around it so I get a good sense of what it was. The full measurement here. And I only made the bow rise up. I didn't make the stern stay flat like a lot of boats that you'll see are out there anyways. Just used the first one that I cut to measure the second side. And obviously I'm doing this much slower. I sped this up so you could see. I went ahead and I actually cut, just angled a little bit, put a bevel on the bow, so that when I glue it together it would hold up nicely. And I'm just using hot glue here right along the edges. Sorry, my hands are out of the screen. It's hard sometimes concentrating and then keeping your hands inside the screen at the same time. But I'm just running a bead of hot glue along the edge of there, and then just pressing this the wall into it and holding it until it goes. You can see that it's a little bit short, which wasn't a big deal. They were both the same length. You can do that. So here, the bevel on the front that I cut, put some hot glue on there, and put that together and glued that. And then I'd already run a bead along the edge too on the bottom and just held it in place. And it was fine using the hot glue here. I didn't mind it because it, I'm putting an actual base that you'll see, so that I can, like a wood base, one of the techniques that I show, on the bottom. So I didn't mind using the hot glue. The hot glue can get really sloppy and messy and leave like clumps, and it just doesn't look very good. You could do this with white glue and with pins, and just set it with pins to hold it in place, and you get a cleaner look. But since I was covering it up with flooring, with the wood flooring, you'll see in a little bit, then I didn't worry so much about that. And just cut the end with a really sharp X-Acto knife. I cut the bow to make it look pretty on the end. And it came out pretty well. Everything came out even. Measurements were good. So now I just measure the back a little bit, and I just measure it, eye it, and then marked it with a pencil and cut it. Yeah, just marked it with the pencil there. and then I turn around and cut it with the X-Acto knife. Didn't worry about it, a box cutter. Didn't worry too much about it being super precise. It was good enough, you know, that I had. Once I glued it down and everything, and again, I was covering up the sides with these lap strakes, and that are simulate wood, and you'll see in a minute what I'm talking about. So again, I didn't really worry much about getting hot glue in there, getting like the little blobs of hot glue on the edges, because everything was getting covered up and it wasn't a big deal. I wasn't very happy here with how when I cut the sides of the boat, how they stuck up a little bit, so I just took my sharp X-Acto knife and trimmed it a little bit. Normally I wouldn't be cutting in that direction. You don't ever want to cut toward your hand, because that's how you slice yourself. But you know, doing this, trying to get this on camera and also get it done, I was cutting some corners here. So I ended up sanding it down afterward, because as you can see, it's a little rough. The cuts came out on that, and so I took a little sandpaper and just sanded it and really flattened out the edges. But I was putting putting more wood covering over the top of that. I think they call it the gunwale, I think, on that. I think that's what it's called, on the top of the boat. Covered that up. So again, I didn't really worry too much about it. But yeah, so it came out really clean and looked pretty good, except for those cuts in the back, which, as I said, I sanded them down. They looked pretty nice. Alright, so here's the technique for putting in the flooring on this, and this is the same technique that I use for the lap strakes on the side. Just doing some small measurements here. So you take a wire brush, and then you just brush along the edges there, and it gives it the sort of grooves of the wood that you want. Trimmed it up a little bit there. Now, I think there was another video that was out there, tutorial, that made this point that you really got to watch and make sure that you're doing that along the grains of this foam, this extruded foam. If you do it the wrong way, it'll rip up the piece. So you'll see what I mean when you start cutting these things. And I had already ripped these on a on a hot wire cutter. You could technically do this with a really sharp blade, cut some thin ones, but you won't get the same consistency on it. There'll be different sizes, and it may not look as good, you know, when you're doing it with a box cutter. So, all right, I sped this up quite a bit, so you didn't have to watch the whole thing as I go ahead and just, you know, just like you're laying flooring here, I'm just cutting these to fit and putting them in there and hot gluing them down on the bottom there. They're very thin, so you want to be careful with the hot glue that you don't melt the piece as you're working. Just continued to slowly work it in there, eyeballing measurements as I went, cutting angles to go, and just eyeballing the whole thing. That's there just to get it to fit in, and it comes together. It's hard to see here on the camera, but when you do use the hot wire, the wire brush on it, it really puts some nice grooves in it. And then once you paint it up, it looks really nice. It looks almost like wood. That's there. You could do this with popsicle sticks if you wanted to, but the foam's easy to work with. I like working with it, and it's easy to cut, and you can cut, you know, good angles without having to trim it with a side cutter or even trying a little saw or something to cut it, or some people use a Dremel even to cut them, you know, when they're doing these things, to cut the popsicle sticks on there. So that's it. So here I take a pen and I'm poking little holes right where two pieces butt up to simulate kind of nails that were driven in there, or it would be pegs that would be driven in there to hold it together. And yeah, and that's it. All right, so here I am on the hot wire cutter, and I've set up the little fence on there, and it's super close to the wire, so these are coming up very thin, as you can see. And these I'm doing for the side. I decided to go with long pieces almost to do the whole entire length of the boat. And like I did with the flooring, I'll stagger these, so you won't be the same with when I'm working on it. And I go much slower on this. I sped the camera up so that, you know, you could just get the general idea of what I was working with here. So yeah, just trim it up, trim the ends up, hit it with the wire brush, And I think one of these, actually, I think I did this against the grain, if you can't see, but I tore some up there while I was working. Put in the hot glue, and these were super thin, so I had to be very careful when I was putting these down. So I just slowly just overlapped them here, leaving about halfway, overlap about halfway up. Just get the glue on there and then trimmed them off as I was working. Went ahead and did the same thing, worked it on the other side. And just continued to glue along here, finish up the side. And just kept working until I got to the top. And that was it. Once I got to the top, then I just put it on the side and trimmed it. There. Yep, trimmed it with the X-Acto knife. Just kept, put them on the side, hit them with the wire brush, glue, rinse, repeat, over and over. This is actually not too tedious of a job, and it looks pretty good, so it's cool to watch. It's not like shingling. But yeah, so that was it. That was one side, and then I flipped it over. Oh no, here I was doing the bow on it. And same thing, just marked it, glued it, and then trimmed it. I go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. Flipped it over. Yeah, it came out, looked pretty good. Flipped over the other side. Same thing, glue. Stick it on there. And the hot glue was fine, it didn't show up. You could do this with PVA, with the white glue, and it would look pretty good. You'd have to put pins in there. I didn't worry so much about the lap strake here on the side. You'll see later that I used white glue for the, I think they're called the gun wheels, I think the top of the boat there. And, yep, trimmed it. And it's a bit off camera, but yeah, you can see right there, just laid it down flat and then just trimmed it, and that was all. And that was it. Alright, so I took some thin pieces here, and I just kind of eyeballed the measurements, and went ahead. This was one of the full pieces, the half-inch pieces that I had cut. And I take a ruler and just kind of get a good idea of what the width is of it. Just went ahead and trimmed it. And because this was going to show right at the front, and it was a very thin piece, if I used the hot glue for it, it would have looked like garbage. So that's why I ended up going with the PVA with the white glue on here. And I just put some white glue down on the ends, and it helped to strengthen up the top of the boat too, where the top of the lap strakes go. So I just put it in there. Yeah, I used my finger the first time around, but later on I just ran a bead right down the line and then just kind of smoothed it in with my finger, rather than use my finger to do that. And I had some big thing of safety pins from my wife's sewing, so I just grabbed some of her safety pins that she had. And once I put these down, I used those to pin to hold them in place. And that's it. Yeah, see, you can see I just ran the bead. Finally gave up with the finger. Just ran the bead along there and took my finger just to smooth it out a little bit. And the PVA glue dries clear, so that's why it's better for this when it's right out in the open and you can see it. Much better to use the white glue rather than to use the other stuff, rather than use the hot glue there, which would clump up and look like garbage. So that's why I didn't do that at all. Didn't want to do that at all. Just took my time setting these things here, making sure everything lined up. Trimmed, and I trimmed off the end too, so with that's what I did there, just to bevel it a little bit so that they would meet there on the bow in a point rather than overlap. And you just go ahead and follow it down, make sure everything's lined up right, and stick them in. This is why I like the foam, because you can stick the pins in there, and once you pull these tiny little pins out, you'll never even notice. And you can also position it better with the hot glue, obviously. Once you put it down, it's stuck for good. And that's it. The white glue, you can actually go back. Like if you don't like it, you could pull the pin, go back, and just position it exactly where you want it. That's what I did. Just used a few pins, put them in there, up and down. Didn't take many. You could have done this with the sides too, with the lap strake, without a problem. You could have used the white glue just to hold it in place there, and it would have looked nice. And you could have put pins, keep it. But I decided to go with the hot glue just because it was quick, and again, it was down on the sides, and you don't really notice at all on that. Yeah, just trim make sure that they connect up at a point. So I trimmed those pieces. Kind of give it an angle on the edge there, rather than have them overlap, which wouldn't have looked very good, obviously. So yeah, just push it in, and I'm actually also pushing it into the lap strake too, to get it to make sure that I get it down in the grooves and everything, because once it dries, it'll help to hold everything together. And despite the fact that this is foam, using that glue on it really toughened it up and firmed it up. It doesn't really matter where you just want the pins to put a good hold there, because otherwise it won't, it might pop out or something if you leave it. Make sure your cat's not around to eat it either. Alright, so for the mast I had these sticks that I got at Michael's, I believe, and I used them for making bridges in the past, and I figured these look pretty good. So I specifically cut in, made some a wedge in there. I did it both on the mast and also on the boom, so that they would fit, because they're round, obviously. Once I did that and I used it with the super glue, they held up pretty well. I was thinking about wrapping. I have some thread that I use for hand sewing leather, and that's what I use later on for this. But oh, it's martini time. So I use that for so I used super glue to hold it together, which was fine. Just mark it in the middle, and then I did the same thing where I put a groove into that, I believe, just to kind of hold it, just to make sure that it had more surface area to connect to. And again, I would have flipped it over. I wouldn't, you never want to cut toward yourself like that. They're pretty much a recipe for disaster, but I did it because, again, working on the camera, I was paying attention to the camera and make sure my hands were positioned so you could see them. It's bad news to do that. So yeah, just a little bit, just trim it. And I used the super glue to hold it together, which held it up nicely. I will say that I ended up trimming down the boom because it was just way too wide and it was hanging over the edge of the ship. So I cut it down, probably just on the edges. I think I took about maybe 1 inch to 1.5 inches off when I did that, just so that I could put the rigging in the rope to do that. So yeah, so I glue it with super glue, and then I just let it sit there. I think I left it overnight, actually. Just put some pieces on it to underneath it, some foam pieces just to hold it up. And nope, it was too big. Just a couple foam pieces underneath it worked great. And that was it. I left it overnight. Came back the next day and it was all decent. Alright, so I tried a couple different ways of putting that, connecting the mast up, but since it was so thin, I couldn't drive it down into the foam. If you're using a big, like a 1/2 inch foam piece, you could actually just kind of drill it out and then put it right down into there. But I ended up making a, looks like a wood block, and then just hot glued it into that wood block that was there. Alright, this is Mod Podge mixed with some black paint, and use that to prime it. The Mod Podge I like using on the foam because it really toughens it up, stiffens everything up, and protects it quite a bit, so it doesn't. So if you drop it or something, you won't bust out the foam. Hindsight, I was thinking I probably should have put some wood along the edges, like I did, some of the fake wood, the thin foam, that I ripped, and then used the wire brush on the inside of the boat, on the walls of it. But it was fine. It painted up okay, and it looked all right on the inside of there. So at that point, when I started painting, and I was looking at it, and I was like, I should have done that. I didn't worry about it too much, so it was good. So I just covered this and the whole thing. I didn't cover the bottom of it. You can, it's not a big deal, but I didn't, because usually these things don't get flipped over. So I don't really worry about it. But you can get a better view of the lap strake here and how it overlaps there. When I also did the one thing you don't see is that I went ahead, like I did when I was putting the flooring in. I took a pen and poked holes where the two pieces butted up against each other to kind of simulate nails or pegs in there holding it in place. On a Viking ship, they would have just used overlapped those boards, and then shoved, most likely it was sawdust mixed with horse fat, and used that to seal any holes. As it sits in the water, the wood would swell, and would close up any gaps, and then any holes or anything they had, they just shoved that horse fat mixed with sawdust directly into it, kind of like caulking that's on it. And so I just covered this whole thing, painted it all with the Mod Podge with the black. You could have done it straight Mod Podge on here and then painted it a lighter color if you wanted to. The Mod Podge does, if you put brown over that, it does come out a lot darker. If you wanted to stick with a straight white Mod Podge and then paint brown over that, it would be significantly lighter. I didn't really need to Mod Podge and prime the mast and the boom, but whatever, it wasn't a big deal. I went ahead and just did it anyway, and painted all of that, and that was fine. And I'm just priming it, so I'm just not working it in there quite a bit. I do find it better if you water some of this stuff down, that it gets in a lot of the cracks and the grooves better when you're working with foam or with anything, because these acrylic paints are very thick, especially some of the cheaper ones that you get from the hobby store. Obviously, if you're using it to paint minis and things like that, when you use a wet palette anyways, it's better. Alright, so this is dried up overnight, and I just went ahead and just painted it brown. Just covered the whole thing. I didn't water down the paint. I just covered it, worked my way all around it, and yeah, no big deal. I didn't worry so much about getting full 100% coverage on the Mod Podge underneath, because I was going to paint it brown over the top of it. I just needed to prime it and get most of it done. You can see those holes really showed up there, where I had to simulate kind of the nail holes for it. They showed up here with the when I used the Mod Podge over it. They still kind of do, although I worked in a bit more of the brown paint to just to make sure it is. You could turn around and you could actually just take a very thin paintbrush and paint those holes black in your boat, and to simulate the nail heads, and they look good. But I didn't do that. They're recessed enough, and they give enough of the view of it. I didn't worry too much about that, but that certainly is an option. And you could put seats in here if you wanted to. Again, since these are all of these I use in games, it's just easier. I don't put seats into it in order to so that the minis can, with the bases, can sit in there nicely. And yeah, it's not a big deal. Obviously, there's no keel on this, and there's no. I didn't put a rudder on it or a wheel on that in order to, but you could add that as well. And I found at hobby stores they have like little wagon wheels that work great, or I bought some gears to do some make dirigible that I built, a big battle dirigible, and I bought a bunch of gears for that because one of my players is an artificer, and so he likes making these things. So I used a bunch of these gears, and I made a bigger boat that I had when I made it was a much larger this dirigible that I made. I used one of the gears for the wheel, the rudder. So I worked it around. That's pretty much it. Touched it up a little bit and left it overnight to dry. Alright, so came back the next day here and I went ahead to cut some sails. And so what I did was I just took that box cutter and poked some holes in it, and then I had some thread that I used for hand sewing leather that's pretty thick, that looked nice for the rigging. You could get some, go to Michael's and they have that, it's nice heavy duty thread that you can get. I just didn't find anything at the hardware store that was small enough that would have looked right. They have some twine, but it's huge. If you're making a big boat, it would probably work just fine. So yeah, so I already had to put the rigging on there, and I ended up taking some of that copper wire, as you can see there, and just gluing some of that into the foam in order to make some rings that I could tie it in, and then just hot glued this stuff on there. So the thing with when you're sewing is you go 4 or 5 times over when you hand sew something with leather, and that makes sure that you got enough thread there. So I think I went 3 times over and I figured that was plenty. Put the needle in there and the thread and just wound it around the boom, tied it around there, and sewed around that thing, sewed it around the boom. I had already put the rigging on. I probably should have put the rigging on after I sewed it, but it wasn't a huge deal. Yeah, I ended up putting some glue on the rigging too to make sure that it held in place and didn't drop off of there. The first couple were not easy, but once I got past the first one and then the sail was hanging on its own, it was fine. And just make sure you don't tie off the rigging at the same time when you're working on it, which I think I did the first time that I did this. It took 2 takes to get it sewn right on here. The other thing I thought about was mixing up some white glue with some water, and then with that sail, I could do paper mache so that the sail, but this is cardstock, and I bent it and it held up pretty nicely and looked like it was flying in the wind there. And I didn't bother measuring any of the holes or anything. I just tried to follow a straight line so it didn't look strange. And here he is on the, wrapping it around for the final piece, and worked it over, and just had him hanging down like, they could raise or lower the sail on the boom. Trim the rope a little bit, and good to go. And that's it. Yep. The copper wire was very thin, so it kept bending. I'd have to bend it up back into place on it. And that's all. It's a pretty simple build. There's some few techniques in here that are not super hard. I mean, the main thing is making sure you got your measurements all right and making sure everything lined up, because it wouldn't look very well. You'd look very good if the bow didn't meet up, and the edges were all lopsided. So yeah, just make sure your measurements are in, and you're done. And that's pretty much it. Not a hard build. Took me about probably 4 hours. Alright, so there it is, sitting there by the docks, sitting in the water. Some mist coming in off in the early morning, getting ready to sail. Alright, well that's it. Thanks a lot for watching. Please subscribe and like.